Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Sandra Fahy, a professor of anthropology and program director for the Bachelors of Global and International Studies at Carleton University, to talk about her book, Marching Through Suffering, Loss and Survival in North Korea. Dr. Fahy, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
So in your book, you talk about a famine that occurred in North Korea in the 1990s. Can you just start by elaborating a bit more on this famine? And can you give a little historical context to what's going on here?
Yeah, so to be brief, but as thorough in terms of the description as possible, the 60s and 70s were considered like the golden years of North Korea, even up into the 80s. And compared to South Korea, which was a kind of authoritarian regime in South Korea, North Korea was doing really well. And kind of on first blush, like whenever I'm teaching this for my students, I often say, like, if I had been a Korean on the peninsula, after the Japanese were defeated, and the two ideas had been sold to me of like the Soviet side or the American side and who's going to be placed in the north side, south side, I probably would have chosen the north side because it's this idea of like our people governing themselves. Yes, the Soviets would help a bit, but it was mostly us, And for a while that would have looked like the better choice. But then, there were things that were not quite, let's say, like functional in North Korea. Like North Korea had been already operating prison camps, already removing anybody that had anything to do with the Japanese. Well, I mean, I guess that's a little bit too much history, going back a little too far from the 1990s, because, yeah, you could see the same thing in South Korea. In South Korea, they were also, going after the communists, putting people in prison. But at the end of the 1980s, you had the collapse of the Soviet bloc. So you had the collapse of this community, which had been helping North Korea quite a bit. And China was still there, Russia was still there, but North Korea had a lot of its debt that was due back to those countries. And in combination with that, North Korea suffered a lot of flooding, a lot of drought, and in addition to that as well, so the third factor is that North Korea, their style of farming was like a kind of juche system of scientific farming, which is this idea of self-reliance and kind of overworking certain fields and things like this, which led to more vulnerability. When, at the early part of the famine, people started to deforest the mountains and plant more kind of crops going up the mountains. And with flooding, this led to more erosion and more risk for communities. So, North Korea did ask for help from the international community. I believe this was around 95. It's in my book, so you can just check it to make sure. But even there, as they asked for help from the international community, they were strictly controlling that. So who would get it, what type of thing they would get. And from the people that I spoke with, some even said that while they were given aid, while the international aid people were there, right after they turned around, they were asked to give it back. So, and there wasn't, some people would say, oh, this is it's a natural disaster. And of course, that's how North Korea tried to put it. They said two things, really. This is a natural disaster. And they also said that the reason we're suffering is because of how the Japanese and the Americans are sanctioning us. And this is a kind of common theme that they even have today. But of course, that's not true. And, people struggled mightily. That it led to a lot of other things, but I won't go into it because maybe some of your questions relate to that. So that's basically how it started. There were a few key factors that led to the famine happening. It wasn't due to natural forces. It was a kind of combination of Soviet bloc collapsing, North Korea having its debts due, Juche scientific farming, which wasn't functional, and North Korea getting aid from the international community but not using it wisely, and then flooding and drought as well. So they had a lot of crop failures.
The title of your book is Marching Through Suffering, which can, on the surface, be taken as a metaphor for the general experiences of the North Korean people. But you also talk about how terms and phrases such as these are used as important ways for the North Korean people themselves to describe the famine and their experiences amongst the famine. Can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Well, so Nakota, you also, in your work on China, probably know, perhaps better than myself actually, that the Chinese call the Great Leap Famine the 3-year natural calamity, I think, which is a very interesting phrase. And North Korea as well called the famine the Konani Hingun. I translate it as the March of Suffering. Other people translate it as the Arduous March. I just think that sounds like more of a mouthful, but that is in standard English the way it's translated. And that phrase referred to Kim Il-sung's defeat of the Japanese, right? So it was, look how difficult Kim Il-sung, our founding father, worked. And you could do the same. Like, he really struggled, and you can struggle too through this against our enemies who would destroy us if we don't struggle enough. And so the Konani Hingun was a term, the Arduous March, that the government used to talk about the famine. They didn't use the word famine, Kigun, Kia. They didn't use that term. But that term first was known to the North Korean people as a descriptor for Kim Il-sung's resistance toward the Japanese. And so what interested me about that is, of course, it shows that there's a big difference between how the state is going to describe a thing and how people describe it. Well, it suggests that, right? What's interesting is when I was doing my interviews with North Koreans in Seoul and Tokyo, Osaka, people who had defected, they didn't talk about it as famine. They didn't use those terms. They explicitly said, oh, you want to talk about the Konani Hingun, you want to ask me about the Arduous March, the March of Suffering. So they immediately used that linguistic handle to describe it. But what was really compelling to me was this seems to suggest that people will use whatever state terms are provided to them, but that wasn't always the case. And maybe you'll ask me a little bit about that going forward, but that was really interesting to me, like how people managed to just devise their survival in a linguistic space that didn't permit overt discussion of survival methods, right? Because a lot of these survival methods were criminalized. The famine was the time when North Korea's markets really began to appear. It was transformative in terms of North Korean society for that and many other reasons as well.
Talking a bit about your sources, can you tell us a little bit more about who some of the people you interviewed were? Of course, I'm sure you can't give away too much personal information, but maybe if you could just tell us a little bit in general terms about who they were and their backgrounds. And in their stories that they told you, could you give us a couple of examples of the most striking stories that they told you and why they resonated with you?
Okay. I had, prior to this podcast, we were just chatting, and I took time off between my master's degree and my PhD. And at that time I was in South Korea, I was learning Korean, and I was volunteering with a lot of North Korean focused NGOs. At that time, 2001, 2002, 2003, there weren't really any NGOs which were run by North Koreans. Yeah. So we're going back like 20 years now, almost. Well, yes, yeah, 20 years now. The landscape of North Koreans in South Korea, or North Korean defectors, let's say, in South Korea, Japan, and indeed in the rest of the world, looked very different. So I'm happy to speak about that if you want. But the individuals that I ended up interviewing were largely connected to me through that NGO community that I was working in. So like I was volunteering to teach English, I was volunteering to read over documents for grants, like all kinds of stuff, whatever I could do, I was happy to help them. And so I started my PhD after that, came back and lived in South Korea again, reconnected with those communities. And I just let people know, like, this is what I'm interested in finding out about. I want to collect oral histories of the famine. I told them that globally, this is not something that exists. There aren't oral histories of famine. This was like 2007 now that I was doing this work with them. And what was really surprising to me is I had anticipated, you know, like you do in research, you anticipate a certain thing. And then when you don't find it, it's so, oh, okay. I had anticipated that people would feel maybe a bit embarrassed or a bit shy or a bit reluctant to speak to me about the famine. So I suppose that's the first kind of surprise, was that everybody was quite eager to tell me about it. And they all said, yeah, I really want to tell you about this history. I really want the world to know what we went through, what I went through. So that's the first thing. In terms of the demographic, you know, I tried to find an even number of men and women. You might know that there are more women who end up defecting. Perhaps they are more successful for various reasons that I could go into than men. Perhaps they find more need to leave North Korea than men. It's difficult to speculate, but I mean, there are some key things that indicate why that would be the case.
I wonder if this has to do with, you know, as I'm sure you've seen interviews with Yeonmi Park, who's probably the most noteworthy refugee from North Korea, who talked about she was inducted into some sort of prostitution ring. And so I wonder if that's maybe an explanation for why it's easier for women to find ways out, because they sort of go through these means to get out.
Yes, as you know, I mean, the kind of biopower of the female body on the illicit world market is high, perhaps like that of children, you know, the use for it is great, particularly in a country like China, which had a one-child birth policy. Now it's been revoked, but that led to a lot of female infanticide. So yeah, so there's demand and there's a supply. And yeah, there's just not as much of a need or desire for men. It's a kind of dubious feature of their own narratives. So yeah, that is precisely what I was hinting at. You know, but what's interesting too is I've heard a lot of North Korean women talk about North Korea as a very sexist society. And despite what the North Korean regime says, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've worked with a lot of North Korean men and I haven't found them to be inappropriate or forward or anything like that. But obviously I'm not a Korean woman, you know, so how they would treat me is perhaps a bit different. But just going back to your question, like I did try to get like a range of folks, like so equal numbers of men and women, people who had come out when they were young, people who had come out when they were older, people from different parts of the country. But like, as you would know, this is a self-selecting group. So when I pull from that, that's all the material I have. So that's what I have to work with. And, you know, a famine will map itself onto a society in a quite an uneven way. And we're seeing that now globally, right? So you're in Los Angeles and I'm in Ontario, and probably the prices are going up for you in Los Angeles, just as they are here in Ottawa. But I personally don't have any struggle in terms of getting access to food. But were we in Yemen, we would have a much different situation. And you can see there are many countries now which are experiencing access to food issues, right? So it's going to be uneven across the planet, and just as it was uneven across the planet of North Korea, right? So famine is never experienced equally by all people. It's people who are more vulnerable. In the case of North Korea, the northern provinces, women, children, according to Songbun, North Korea's kind of political inheritance system, according to occupation, all kinds of things like that, you know? I'll just say one other thing about the being in the field, which is that the fact that I was, you know, a non-Korean and a non-Asian was somewhat helpful, because North Koreans, sometimes they would refer to us collectively, like me and them, as foreigners, you know, us foreigners in South Korea, you know, and so there was a sort of kinship in terms of, well, for good or not, seeing South Koreans as other to ourselves. Indeed, you know, the experience of being, you know, in Asia and being visually different, how you can sometimes be treated, but if you speak the language or not. And indeed, North Koreans are treated differently in South Korea, you know, because of their accents, perhaps sometimes because of the way they look. So yeah, and they knew that I was on their side. They knew that I was interested in learning more about them, and didn't have some of the fears and prejudices that South Koreans have been educated to believe are important to them, you know. I'll just say one more thing, which is that a lot of the times when I was in South Korea, of course, South Koreans would ask me, oh, wow, you speak our language really well. Why are you learning our language? And I'd say, oh, it was obviously a little awkward. I would say, oh, I'm interested in meeting North Koreans and collecting their oral history about the famine. Many people thought it was really weird. I'd have one of two reactions. Either they would say, oh, it's so wonderful you're doing that, and we should be doing that because they are our people. You're a foreigner and you're doing that, wow. Or they would say, oh, isn't it scary to meet North Koreans? Yeah, so that happened in both South Korea and Japan, those sorts of reactions.
Can you comment a little bit on how the government had responded to the famine? And what does their response tell us about the mechanisms of the state and the way that it typically functions?
That's a good question. You know, at the very beginning of my book, I think probably in the introduction and in the back of that book as well, I have like a brief history of the famine and how it came about. North Korea's governmental response to the famine was, well, first of all, linguistic. So they were going to control how people understood what was happening to them. And they tried to control how people understood the causes and the solutions of what was happening to them. And, you know, North Korea, and many defectors said this to me, again, it's a self-selecting sample of people, but many reported this. And in fact, in later years, when I've met many elite North Koreans from Pyongyang, they said that they did get food aid. They received food aid. So North Korea was interested in, the government was interested in providing, you know, Pyongyang with everything that it needed, because that is really where the population needs to be satisfied. The government didn't care if people were dying in the northern provinces or if people were struggling. You know, teachers were falling asleep in their desks. Students noticed, oh, the teacher's now selling cigarettes at the market. You know, North Korea did try to crack down on the markets at first, and then eventually gave in to that. Yeah, and to this day, there's no record of how many people died during the famine. That's a bit of a clunky measurement stick to find out how bad a famine is, because when you have a famine, most people do survive. More people are impacted by it than the people who perish as a result of it. North Korea also arranged for, you know, guards to be on duty minding certain farms so that people wouldn't steal things. You know, this type of thing was going on. So, you know, they knew, the leadership knew that the famine was happening. They accepted international aid and siphoned it off to the elite in the country, to the military, and yeah, didn't get the medicine and food aid to those who needed it most.
One point in your book that I think is important is you write, quote, when we examine North Korea as a country that lacks and as a people who lack, the starkness of such reductionism distracts us from identifying how both individuals and the state make do, come to terms, and cope with difficulties.
Mhm.
And I think this is an important point because despite the fact that North Korea is a repressive state, it can still simultaneously be dynamic. So I'd like
Yeah.
to know in what ways since the 1990s with the death of Kim Il-sung has the North Korean state evolved, innovated, etc. And if you could also comment on the ways in which the people themselves have evolved and innovated in the way that they live out their lives. So of course, in the 90s to now that you're talking about a big swath of time, but maybe if you could comment kind of generally in what ways has both the government and society been dynamic and evolving?
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you read from the text because I mean, probably like a lot of people who write books, I never look at the book again. So it's interesting, and as you read it, I remember right. Oh, okay. And then the end part of the sentence, I was like, oh, that's sort of okay. I remember that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so thank you anyway for reminding me of it. Yeah, I guess why I wrote that is because what really struck me was how creative North Koreans were with language, how dynamic they were with language, how kind of fun and free in a way, because they had to work within such confines in terms of censorship, right? So that really struck me. And I guess I saw parallels for that in things like, a truck can no longer run on gasoline. There's no access to gasoline. So they transform it. I'm not a mechanic, so I don't know how they did this, but transform it to run on firewood, so that's how it's functioning. I mean, all kinds of things like this. There's no trash in North Korea. Like everything is used and reused. Everything is made use of. And I see a parallel with that with the regime as well. So for instance, diplomats and ambassadors who are working abroad are often working two jobs. One, which is the official one that the government has asked them to do in terms of representation, creating alliances, and also the more illicit one of bringing in items back into North Korea or getting certain access to cash, US dollars or euros, this type of thing. So yeah, that again, just the same thing. I don't want to say that the people were just like the regime. I'm not saying that. And I'm also not saying that they were completely different from the regime. All I'm saying is that I noticed that the regime was very creative in problem solving, like on the linguistic level and on the actual practical level, right? So North Korea evades sanctions in all kinds of creative ways, like with ships using false flags or trading or changing flags or, transferring goods on the high seas so that they're not let's say, international waters, things like this. They send workers overseas and they send them to countries where, human rights are sort of not really protected very much. So China, Russia, the Middle East, so they kind of make do, I suppose, almost, I guess, in the way like it's a criminal state. So yeah, as a criminal would, they're going to make do with what they have and how they can manipulate it. And so in a like way, or in a similar way, the people also did creatively negotiate. So that's where you saw the black markets coming up, or what has also been called the Grasshopper Markets. So people would have their goods, but then the minute they saw guards coming, they would jump up and run away like a grasshopper. And when the guards left, they would come back and sell their goods again. Or North Koreans decided to leave into China. Incidentally, that's something that I'm talking about the 1990s now. When the Great Leap Famine was happening in China, many came over into North Korea, which is interesting. So yeah, I mean, that is something that I found very surprising in the research that I was doing. And I was very happy to find that, obviously, because it shows, an entrepreneurial spirit, a creativity, a kind of insistence on living. I mean, I'm talking about the people, not so much the state now, but
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I just had one more question, and I typically don't like getting into American politics on this show, but I feel like this question is relevant, and it's one that can have an interesting conversation and being addressed. But I think back to the early Obama years. He didn't say this verbatim, but one of his sentiments was, your enemies can't be your enemies forever, and that was sort of what led him to working more with places like Cuba and Iran. Nixon was working with China to get them to open up because maybe we could get American capitalism in there and help transform them that way. One of the noteworthy aspects of Donald Trump's presidency is that he seemed to really be trying to engage in new ways with North Korea that previous presidents hadn't, although he'd been criticized for this. I wonder how you sort of make sense of Trump's interactions with Kim Jong-un. Were there elements of what he did that is commendable, or did he go about it the wrong way? I wonder what you think about that. And sort of as an extension of this question, do you think in our lifetimes there's a possibility we can see an open North Korea?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. And yeah, I guess sometimes people are a bit shy to bring in American politics vis-a-vis North Korea. Sometimes you might hear people say, oh, let's not bring politics into topics about human rights. But it's already there. It's already there. So I don't know why people say like, oh, we need to keep these things separate, because they're already mixed together. And, I've kind of gone back and forth in my own thinking about engagement, isolation, strategic engagement. Yeah, so I go back and forth in my mind, and some of it has changed as a result of the research I've done. Some of it changes as a result of what changes I see happening in North Korea. A lot of people, when Kim Jong-un came into power, thought, and I think this was quite racist, they thought that because he had grown up in Europe, he would be different. So that's why I say that's racist, because, well, what is Europe somehow civilized and Asia is not, But of course, nonetheless, people had that idea. And then there he is assassinating his half-brother in Malaysia with the ex-agent, which North Korea is the only state that has access to, or has used. So, with Trump, he was just sort of a phenomenon for me to observe, because he knew so little about politics. And in fact, I don't mean to sound mean, but he knew so little about anything. To my assessment. And I thought, well, this could be possibly interesting, because he's, in my assessment, so naive. Maybe he can shake things up a little bit. And I guess he did in some ways. Well, I mean, this is, I guess, the only thing I can say in relation to your question is, anytime North Korea is negotiating, it's a counterintelligence operation. They're not negotiating on, what's the word, like true faith. In my assessment, it's a manipulation, because they don't trust. They don't trust the British. They don't trust even, I think, those who are aligned with them, Chinese, the Russians. So if you're going to engage with North Korea, I think then you need to just know that they won't be transparent in what they're doing. Take for instance this, Tae Young-ho defected, you might recall, from the North Korean consulate in London. And he has written a book, and soon I guess the English version of it is going to come out from Columbia University Press. In that book, he talks about how North Korea deliberately started to accuse the US of bringing out the human rights topic as a way of deflecting from the nuclear issue. So they accused the United States of doing that, but then they also deliberately did that themselves. and Tae Young-ho goes into much more detail about this, but he says, or he said, quoting the leadership, that this was part of the strategic aim, to bring up the nuclear issue as a way to distract from the human rights issue. So I just don't think it's a trustworthy state. Like I said to you before we began recording, I would never encourage anyone to travel there because of the use. Like I said about the reduce, reuse, recycle, North Korea makes use of a lot of material, and it will make use of, foreign bodies or ethnic Korean bodies that go there. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. What are your thoughts?
Well, I can give my thoughts in a moment, but I guess just to address the last part of that question quite briefly, I mean, you seem a bit cynical, but do you think we can see an open North Korea at some time in our lifetimes, or are you more cynical about it?
Yeah, let me talk about that actually, because so this is what's interesting to me, because I started working on North Korea. I started working on this topic of, well, not North Korea, but North Koreans. I started working with North Koreans now 20 years ago. And in my lifetime, I've already seen a huge change in terms of that landscape, right? And internally, I suppose there have been quite a few changes in North Korea as well. But they've been more incremental in terms of my assessment. In terms of North Korean defectors, back in the day, like 2001, 2002, I remember saying to friends and colleagues, oh, imagine now if we could have like, a North Korean stand-up comedian, or, North Koreans living in Europe or living in America and speaking up. And we have that now. We have way more North Koreans who are writing their memoirs, who are speaking up. And of course they receive criticism, because dissidents are going to receive criticism. I mean, this is almost completely orchestrated by the North Korean regime. It does a lot of that on its own. So that landscape has really changed. And in terms of what we see domestically, like North Korea now has markets. Bribing will get you a lot of things in North Korea now, much more than ever before. So we are seeing change. Will we see it in our lifetime? Maybe. I mean, I really hope we do, because it's a tragedy. You see how successful South Korea is economically, politically, socially, in terms of soft power. And the same could be true of North Korea if it were to kind of unleash the people from under its, political shadow. That's my thinking. So it could change. But a lot of time, those of us who work on North Korea feel sort of, cynical and a bit despondent, because the changes seem to happen so slowly. But when looking back over the last 20 years, I've seen a lot of changes just in my own lifetime.
Mm-hmm. To give my own 2 cents, since you'd asked there at the end, it seems to me, I studied China, which, does have some overlap in the way that it manages its country to North Korea, although I think sometimes people unfairly compare them as being one and the same. China is certainly much more open. They are certainly much more liberal, although not certainly to the standard of the US. But, when I think about engagement with a place like North Korea, of course, by helping the government grow its country, you are in a sense sort of supporting that oppression. Mm-hmm. However, and this is just sort of my layman's opinion, I wonder if, even if there's still oppression existent within that system, if you can still just make that system even a little bit better for the general populace, it seems to me like there's still some value then in engaging with North Korea. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong in that thinking.
I think if we can just extend this for a minute to say, I agree with you. Let me say it's all in terms of how we're engaging, because the linchpin for me is really in access to information. And many people thought, oh, the internet, if people get access to the internet in North Korea, well, North Korea has created all kinds of mechanisms to trace. Curtis Melvin has written a lot about this, excellent research to find out, so this flash drive has been copied on this computer by this person, all kinds of software that North Korea has created to be able to track these things. So just, I suppose you could say the same thing in China. There is access to the internet, but there's also profound surveillance that's going to be tracking things. And So I do think that access to information is the thing that has to transform. That's the thing that needs to be changed. And I'm just going to say as an example of why. So for instance, many people thought that if North Koreans saw like bags of cornmeal that said like, oh, a gift from America, right, in Korean, that they'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, this is, oh, America's actually trying to help us out. And I think I wrote about this in the book too, that like, you know, people see a really nice bicycle made in Japan. I mean, Japan makes beautiful bicycles, right? And, you know, they'd see, oh, this bicycle's made in Tokyo or whatever. But then how they would interpret it isn't that, oh, we should be like Japan. We should have a free competitive market too, because that's how this has been produced so well. Instead, they interpret it like, oh, Japan's able to do that because of how they persecute us, and they've taken advantage of us. So, you know, I've talked about this a lot. I think I mentioned it in the book, but, you know, a fact doesn't come with its meaning attached. And that is key, because in North Korea, the meaning is put on the thing, and it seems quite convincing to them. To us, it might seem shocking, but it's quite convincing to them because they lack so severely other information, the ability to contextualize it. So the gift from America, the cornmeal that's a gift from America is, oh, because America feels so bad for what they did. They're not giving this out of the genuineness of their heart. We're not able to, you know, one of the other things that I found so shocking, I'll just, sorry, now I'm remembering everything, but North Koreans, this was another thing, my own naivete. I thought that they would immediately interpret, or at some point interpret, the fact that that promissory relationship between the government and them in terms of food delivery, right? That's the agreement, that if that was broken, then they would begin to critique the government. But that fact that the relationship was broken and that they weren't given food, that fact was given a particular meaning. And the meaning was that, you know, the government would like to provide for you, but it can't right now because of how it's being treated by the international community.
Dr. Fahy, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.